I think folks are still, just feel free to cram in as you come in. There's some seats up here as well. I don't bite, but I don't know about Michelle. I don't know. I think she doesn't bite either. But feel free to keep coming up forward, and we'll get started here. It's really sweet of you all to come up. There's a lot of great pieces up there and a lot of great folks, but grateful to answer Hassel Short. You may have seen Michael downstairs in the community basket meeting. They have recently formed the Michigan Deathcare Collective, and then Art 634, Gracie Toth with Third Coast Herbal Collective. This is all a collective effort, and so it's really exciting to have folks come. Maybe they kind of shared a little at the beginning downstairs, but grateful to them and grateful to you all for coming. And I know this is a really interesting topic. Not many people talk about death, let alone put on an art exhibit for it. So this is really special. Oh. Oh yes, thank you. Yes, if you wouldn't mind just vibrating your phone. Thank you, Mary Lynn. That's a great reminder for me as well. And I guess another note of thanks to Mary Lynn. A lot of the information that I've used, if you all have maybe interacted with Mary Lynn Rush, I've been calling her the godmother of end-of-life doulas in Michigan and the nation, but she's really informative when it comes to green burial. I will say, if you, another godmother in my lens is Lee Webster from the Green Burial Council, and a lot of the information here, it comes from Lee as well. So with that said, too many thanks, but I don't know if you can have too many thanks. I was going to say, you can see a little plant in our logo there. I discovered 50% of the oxygen that we breathe comes from phytoplankton in the ocean. But I'd like to take a moment to, be grateful for the other 50%, which depends on the soil. And I think as the topic is soil to soil, I think I just want to say thanks to the air that we're breathing from the plants. So let's see if my computer will go out right here. Find my cursor. There we go. This is just, I'll try to be somewhat brief because I want to cover a lot of ground here, but I'll share a little bit about my background, a little overview of modern burial, and then what green burial, natural burial, and specifically conservation burial is, and why it's so important, and then a little bit about the nonprofit that we started. Since this is an art gallery, I figured I'd share a little note about art. These are two quotes I felt like were pretty on point to this topic, and I'll read them here. The first one is from Makoto Fujimura. To know an artist is to know both the depth of sorrows and the heights of joy. We need to consider the arts as a way to value life's mysterious details, and a way to train our senses to pay attention to the world. Artists are the conduits of life, articulating what all of us are surely sensing, but may not have the capacity to express. And then the second quote from Francis Bacon, the job of the artist is always to deepen the mystery. And I think that artists, that's maybe one of the chief aims, to deepen the mystery. And for many people, chief of those mysteries is death. And to be drawn deeper into that mystery is crucial. And I think it's interesting thinking about the spaces we inhabit, and we're in an art gallery here. But if we can create spaces to be drawn deeper into a mystery such as death and sit with the emotions that brings, it may help us catch a glimmer of hope on the far side, and also to just sit with some of the despair and loss and grief that death brings, and in so doing, create spaces of healing. So that's, I kind of view this at gallery as a space of healing, and the larger project of creating a conservation cemetery is ultimately to create a space of healing and hope in nature and creation. And one of the chief sources of healing is the soil. And the soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all. It's the healer and restorer and resurrector, by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life. I feel like that really sums up why we're here, both to restore the soil, restore the land, and restore our relationship with it and each other. And that's one of the main aims of Jeremiah Commons. And so I'll share a little bit about who I am. I grew up in Jackson County on the west side of the county. I'm a born and raised Michigander. My wife, Sherry, is also born and raised. She's the co-founder of Jeremiah Commons, and I'm kind of the executive director. She's been very supportive and patient with all of my shenanigans since we started this project. I grew up land. My brother and I, my sister and my brother's right here as well, but we had woods across the street. We would often, traipse through the woods. My grandfather had horses and helped tend those horses. And in high school, I would bale hay and just kind of proximate to a lot of these agricultural activities and life-giving land activities. I went to undergrad. I studied philosophy and communications with a focus on environmental ethics. From a Christian perspective, I kind of explored what are these dirty virtues of stewardship, of restoration, of living in reciprocity with the land. I wrote my senior thesis on our moral relationship with nature. And so kind of asking some of these questions, what is it, how do we live in right relationship with the rest of the world around us? So after graduating, my wife and I, we bought a house with some land on the west side of the county. We had chickens, a dog, a couple of cats, and it budded up to a huge forest out back. And we'd often go outside and we loved living in proximity to the I felt a call to go to seminary. And so we moved down to Durham, Master's of Divinity program at Duke Divinity School with a certificate and a concentration in food, faith, and environmental justice. And so that's where it's in the water down there, these kind of agrarian sensibilities and creation care. And so, wrestling with this question of how can we communally orient ourselves towards something that often feels like a commodity. So, something we put no trespassing signs out. We have it's a big thing in this country, and there's some good to that, but often the dark side leaves folks in lurch. And so is there a way that we can cultivate an attitude of communal restoration towards the land? And when we were down in North Carolina, we toured some wonderful places. There were farms, there were monasteries, some places called themselves pharmasteries. There were some communal gardens, and we thought, wow, these are people who are doing the great work of digging into the soil, restoring it together. It wasn't just this kind of individual project. It was people coming around and doing this good, dirty work together. And so, we kind of were starting to wrestle with these questions. When we moved back to Michigan, when we moved back to our hometown, our home soil, we want to try to figure out how do we do this? So we were sitting with a few of these ideas, and we have a passion for food and good food and caring for the soil that produces this food and cares for us. And while we were asking these questions, one of my professors had a panel of folks come in, and the question was, how do we care for our bodies after we die? And it hadn't been on my radar. I had been wrestling with these land questions, and one of the panelists, it was the two pair partners who had started Blue Stem Conservation Cemetery. So this is just outside of North Carolina. And I had never heard of natural burial before. And I just, at that point, I felt like a huge light bulb went off in my head. I said, this is amazing. I need to figure this out. And so I went and chatted with Jeff, and he said, hey, just come out and visit the cemetery. So I said, okay. I made the drive out, and I pulled up, and it was him and his dog. They were, I think, digging or fixing a picnic table or something. And if you've ever been to Dahlem or the Sharon Creek Preserve or any nature preserve that you've been to recently, it was like pulling into that. It didn't look like a cemetery. And he said, hey, I'll take you on a tour. And, he pointed out the nature sanctuary, the natural sanctuary, which, the stained glass windows were these beautiful, leaf canopy. And there was an outdoor chapel. There was a pond. He said, we're going to try to start a communal farm over here. And over here, we started walking through the burial preserve. And it was this great wildflower meadow they were restoring. It had been industrially farmed, and they planted 10,000 pounds of native wild burial there last week. And I just stopped because in that moment, the place became so much more sacred to me. It was a moment where, and here was the soil, or sorry, there was the soul returning back to the soil, and his dog was running around. There were birds chirping, and it was in that moment I thought, this is the communal orientation. Folks coming around in the midst of grief and loss and caring, putting roots in the land together once a loved one had passed, in a way to kind of reframe your relationship with the land. And so in that moment I came back, and Sherry says she remembers how like kind of crazy and frazzled I was, and said, we're gonna try to figure this out. And so I've been obsessed with natural burial for the last few years. And it's been a great community of learning. I think there are folks who have done amazing work up to this point, Mike and Mary Lynn, and there are others in the Michigan community who have been doing this for a long time, and it's been great to get to know them. I also want to acknowledge this is, I think Mike likes to say, this is the newest, oldest thing. This has been around for as long as humans have been around. We've been burying our loved ones like this. First Nations people also have had a communal orientation towards the land. Amish, Jewish, Mennonite Christians, or Mennonites, Orthodox Christians, Muslims, a lot of them have these traditions as part of their religion. And so I just want to acknowledge that this is ripe for communal engagement. To have this kind of relationship and conversation across difference has been really fruitful and beautiful for me. And so that's one thing I want to acknowledge. This is just a brief chart. Whoa, we're flying. I want to chart just a quick history, really briefly. Some of you may recognize, I'm not talking to Siri, this crazy Apple Intelligence thing.
I'm currently speaking at 75%.
This is Abraham Lincoln on his deathbed. Around this 1865. So in the Civil War is when embalming became really popular. Humans have been practicing this in various ways prior to that. But from the East Coast all the way back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, there were several spots where the embalmers filled his body with arsenic to preserve the tissue so that folks could come and pay their respect and visit Abraham Lincoln. Also, very wealthy families might have their sons embalmed to transport back home. And in the late 1800s, 1890s, when they switched from arsenic to formaldehyde, and which is a lot safer than arsenic. But embalming, and I should mention, in Michigan, there are a few requirements for when embalming is required. If you have like Crooksfeld, Jacobs, or if there's transportation after 48 hours, and there are exceptions to this, and I'm sure you please ask Mike these questions later on. But some of the typical body disposition practices today, beyond just embalming, primary of which is cremation, followed by traditional cemetery interment. And so this is from the National Funeral Directors Association's 2024 report. 61% of Americans were cremated. 33% were buried, and that's various forms of burial. You can see the dramatic increase since 1960. Only 4% were cremated, and it's expected to be 82% in 2045. And so we have this kind of predominant way of body disposition, and a lot of reasons for that. One is cost, simplicity, and some religions actually require cremation at death. There are environmental impacts to these, and that's one reason why we started Jeremiah Commons, is with this kind of call to care and steward the land and in creation. We want to be as environmentally sustainable as possible. All that to say, I never want to come in. Some people have their end-of-life plan already, and so I never want to appear confrontational. I only am offering these things as a fruitful conversation for potential alternatives. With that said, some of the environmental impact of modern burial, you can see some of the stats there in cremation. An interesting stat I heard: if you take all of the material put in the ground from conventional burial in a year, it's the same as burying 2 Golden Gate bridges in the earth. That's in 1 year. It's just wild to me that all of that material is put into the ground in 1 year for traditional burial.
Go ahead and go right in front over there.
Oh yes, please, yeah, grab a seat. Come on down. Enter Green in America started actually in this is a shot of a natural burial at Larkspur Conservancy in Nashville, Tennessee. That was started about 8 years ago. But this journey, well, I'll start with the definition. This is from the Green Burial Council, but it's a contemporary way to name the beautiful and ancient practice of interring loved ones in the earth free of chemicals and non-biodegradable materials. I think just a way to think of it, anything that would stop the soul's movement to soil is not green burial. And so when we remove those things and make that as easy of a process as possible, so if you think of a pine casket or the caskets that are being woven downstairs, these are natural biodegradable materials that produce and actually restore the soil's condition and allows the body to return to the earth. And so that's green burial kind of fairly succinctly. And then this is a wonderful infographic that I modified from Nathan Butler. But if you just think of a typical cemetery, it has a mowed landscape with larger headstones, and then you have various types of caskets. And natural burial, green burial, you have an optional discrete marker. And then it's instead of 6 feet deep, you got 3.5, about 3 to 4 feet. That's where all the good microbes and nematodes and microorganisms are that'll help decomposition, and no involvement. And so, it's very much conducive to the soul-to-soil movement. Some of the benefits, and I think chief of which, well, there's that's my phrase tonight, chief of which, but I think that a lot of the reason why I'm passionate about this is because of the community that is possible out on the far end. But the point's not to take up space; it's to become soil. One of my mentors in this space says it's the good kind of taking up space. I think a lot of folks maybe push back that these conservation cemeteries are really just taking up land that could be used for, housing or food production. And that's a whole other conversation. But I would like to say that this is, by becoming soil, you're helping preserve the land, and not only preserving it, but restoring it. So these are some of the other benefits listed. But on the community piece, some cemeterians are saying that they actually perform more baptisms, or an equivalent amount of baptisms and weddings in these nature sanctuaries because the land is being preserved and protected and has mining of death and life together. And so my wife and I were there, are these deaf people or are they wedding? And it's kind of nice to think of it all being intertwined. It harkens back to the Office White Shrew wedding. But some of these are really powerful benefits, I think. There are 3 different types of natural burial cemeteries, and these are the 3 types that the Green Burial Council certifies. And I'll mention, but Jeremiah Commons hopes to be a Green Burial certified conservation cemetery, which is on the right side here. A hybrid cemetery is a space that has both conventional burial and natural or green burial. But you have a typical cemetery design, and depending on the layout, some may be interspersed, or they may have a portion for natural burial. This is actually a wonderful family a little southeast of here. This is a space where you only have natural burial. Conservation cemetery is active land restoration. So you have at least 20 acres that is protected under a conservation easement in partnership with a land trust. And so it's been really cool to see all the different ways that this is played out across the country. Currently, I believe there's only 12 Green Burial certified or Green Burial Council certified conservation cemeteries. But there are about 23 that are doing this kind of, even if they aren't certified. But you have these active restorative practices here. And so I want to make sure that we're okay on time here. It's kind of a chart of the history. I think this is a really interesting stat. I had a previous information here from a Cates Boyle survey where it said that 82% of people would prefer a green burial. And I realized that the pool that survey was drawn from was people who are already kind of in green burials, mindset. This is really interesting. This is the entire NFDA recent report where now 68 of an entire pool, a large breadth, would consider this. And I think it just maybe shows you a larger shift in some of this interest. And these are just some of the numbers down at the end. So I love, this is a quote by Lee Webster. It's cut off at the bottom here. Conservation cemeteries are a vehicle for transformative experiences that include direct participation before and during the funeral, and ongoing opportunities for engagement through life-affirming activities such as bird watching, hiking, weddings, baptisms, family picnic days, community education. And I think that since this has been really meaningful and impactful way to participate in their loved one's end of life, but also just to think on the far end, this is not just for folks, in this space. This is for the full gamut from birth to earth, from womb to tomb. I think this is a really cool space, again, for community orientation towards land in the midst of loss and grief and peace and all of life's activities. So what is Jeremiah Commons? I'll end by just briefly sharing a few. We were formed as a nonprofit and I was birthed there. I kind of joke, Sherry's labored for 2 kids, and it's not necessarily the equivalent, but it's also, we just got our tax-exempt 501c3 status. We were informed of that at the end of 2024. And so our hope is to one day have land to plant this, in which to plant this vision. So our mission is to have all folks have access to these beautiful and meaningful activities. That are some of our values: fellowship, stewardship and service, rest and delight, and prayer and worship. Pin Oak Preserve is kind of the working name for the cemetery, but I think that we probably I would say so much of this is being put up. We may adjust the name, but this is again another burial at Larkspur. I'll just briefly share. Inevitably, any nonprofit has part of the DNA of its founders. But at the same time, and so as a faith-based nonprofit, that's our commitment is to steward land, steward creation, and enter into a reciprocal relationship with the land from what I would feel is our Christian call. But burial at Pin Oak or wherever this would be open to everyone, and there's no limitations and unique cultural services. I should say the only limitation would be you can't plant autumn olive on your gravesite. Or there are certain limitations, beyond just there are conservation limitations, I should say. And the land trust we partner with will be sure to implement those. So this is the vision. Here are some sources, and I'll wrap up here. If you'd like to learn more, I have a stack of books with more information and some of the sources that we use. Here, if you'd like to join, I'd love to have you join, and on our newsletter, if you'd like to give a tax-deductible gift, that's the link. I'd like to end with one last note of maybe hope. It's maybe hope skew. This is a really cool art exhibit, and I think it's so great. Soul to soil. It's the letter. Souls. I'm not going to get into the whole soul and body tension and conversation, but I have the personal conviction that we aren't souls dragging along bodies, and we aren't bodies dragging along we are souls and bodies. It's our bodies, the parts that need to sleep, our feet, but it's both our souls and our bodies are nourished. And I think when we're talking about a topic as heavy as death, quotes, a lot of folks say things like this, but even like Greta Thunberg has her quote, what we don't need is more hope. We need people who are acting, because when you act is when you find hope. Fred Rogers says this quote, when things are looking scary, look for the helpers. This to little children, but it's the people who, when things are looking dire and you're in the midst of some sort of turmoil, the people who have the hope are the ones who seem to be doing the dirty, gritty work that are kind of in and amongst that. And I view natural burial as a little bit of a last and final act of hope when things are looking bleak and there's despair and grief and loss. That to lay your body in the earth and let it return to soil can be one of the most hopeful things we can do. And so that's the work I hope to do in the future. And I'm really grateful that there's so much interest in this. So thanks for taking the time and listening.
Where does the name come from? Jeremiah Thomas?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of conversation around that. The prophet in the Old Testament, Christian Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is often called the prophet of the land, would often speak to the Israelites about how they're neglecting their relationship with the land and how it's messing up their relationship. And so there's a beautiful passage of Jeremiah, you need to go, but Babylon's invading, and it looks like everything's burning down around him. And the voice of the Lord comes to Jeremiah and says, you need to buy your hometown. There's some land in your hometown you need to buy. Even though you're not going to be able to do anything with it, there's still going to be seeds planted, and children are going to grow there, and gardens are going to bloom, even beyond you might be able to inhabit that place. And so it's really a profound act of hope, even when things are burning down around him. They still kind of rooted to this land. So that's the name. We are also in the midst of considering if we need to change that name. I think that there's, again, it's a hopeful kind of background. Yeah. Oh, and actually, yes, I was going to share just a little bit of friend of Deathcare. So I will turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Tony. Don't you just love listening to him speak? It is really inspiring.